What we know always changes when the medium through which we know changes. In a world where AI can easily produce all kinds of content, the real edge will go to those who can use AI to generate new knowledge. My name is Paolo Granata. I'm a professor in Book and Media Studies at the University of Toronto and the founding director of the Media Ethics Lab. I'm the author of Generative Knowledge, Think, Learn, Create with AI, exploring the implications of artificial intelligence on our intellectual life. A book to understand how AI changes the way we know what we know, how AI reshapes the very processes by which knowledge is circulated, validated, generated, and exploring new forms of knowledge made possible by the advent of AI. And most importantly, understanding how AI changes the way we think, the way we learn, the way we create. The future of knowledge is already here, and I call it generative. Knowledge should become more and more generative, meaning knowledge that produces further knowledge. And in a knowledge ecosystem that is already saturated with AI generated content, this distinction between knowledge that preserves and knowledge that creates will become the critical divide. What will matter is the capacity to use what we know to generate something new. New questions, new connections, new understanding. And as AI will handle more of the routine jobs, and as we delegate some cognitive tasks to AI, this can free us to do what we actually do best: exercise judgment, assign meaning, think creatively, care about consequences, and choosing the direction for advancing knowledge. So the future of knowledge depends on whether we use that freed up cognitive space wisely or not. After all, the future of knowledge is an ethical question. That means who gets to create knowledge, whose perspectives are included, what standards of rigor we maintain. And all these decisions will shape whether or not AI enriches the human intellectual project. And that's why the future of knowledge is all about what kind of thinkers we choose to become. Across ages in human history, we have always been thinking through something. Language, writing, the printing press, the telescope, and so on. These were not just tools that made life easier. They changed what we could think, what questions we could ask, what counted as knowledge. And I call them epistemic or intellectual technologies. Technologies whose primary function is to mediate our relationship with knowledge, and so affecting our intellectual life. And AI belongs to this lineage, to this media trajectory. Likely the most powerful epistemic technology our species has ever produced. Any epistemic technologies modifies the maps of knowledge. And here's the crucial part. No epistemic technology is neutral. Marshall McLuhan understood this better than anyone. The medium is the message. The printing press didn't just spread existing ideas faster. It created entirely new ways of thinking, personal reasoning, individual authorship, standardized knowledge. The printed book, over a few centuries, reshaped the mind of the reader. And AI does the same. When we think with AI, we don't just get answers more efficiently or analyze regularities more precisely or generate content so easily. Our cognitive habits shift. The way we frame questions changes. And even what we consider relevant changes. The tool shapes the thinker. And this is why I insist on calling AI an epistemic technology rather than just a productivity tool. If we just treat AI as a tool or as a service, we miss the deeper transformation. AI is restructuring the very conditions under which knowledge gets created, validated, shared. So understanding this, I believe, is the first step for using AI wisely. So what I call an intelligent use of artificial intelligence. What we know always changes when the medium through which we know changes. And AI is no exception. I describe AI as an interface for knowledge. And I mean something very specific, even in relationship with other interfaces of knowledge. Think about the book, the printed book. After Gutenberg, the book became the quintessential interface for knowledge. For centuries, the book mediated how communities conceived knowledge, how they challenged knowledge, how they renewed or validated knowledge. And the book also shaped new institutional practices, research, education, innovation at large. It shaped new reading habits. It created the very concept of individual authorship. And the circulation of books raised up new needs for standards, for verification, for scientific validation, and so on. So the printed book was an interface for knowledge. It mediated how people accessed, organized, produced knowledge for about 5 centuries. But the book was never just a container. It was an active medium, a generative medium. It determined the conditions under which knowledge could exist and circulate. And AI today does the same, even if at a completely different scale and pace. In fact, AI mediates our relationship with what we know, how we come to know it, and even what we consider worth knowing. And this means that AI raises the same questions that the printing press once raised about the so-called epistemic authority, the originality, epistemic trust, the intellectual responsibility. And because all interfaces are never passive or neutral containers, because they shape what passes through them, that means that AI, while giving us access to information, it affects what we pay attention to, how we frame problems, what connections we notice, what we overlook. This is what I mean when I say that the interface is never neutral. The interface filters, prioritizes, structures. For instance, when we interact with a language model, we are not just retrieving knowledge. We are thinking within an environment that has its own structure, its own biases, its own logic, its own architecture. As an interface of knowledge, AI reshapes the very conditions under which knowing becomes possible. In my book, I developed a definition of artificial intelligence that might sound a bit unusual, unconventional, but I think it captures something essential, particularly to understand AI from a cultural perspective. I call AI the ars artificialiter cognoscenti. This is Latin that translates as the art, the skill, the expertise of knowing through artificial means. And this Latin definition actually echoes the expression that was used in the 15th century to describe the printing press. In its early days, the printing press was called ars artificialiter scribendi, so the art of artificial writing. And just as Gutenberg's printing press reshaped the entire ecosystem of knowledge in the modern age, AI today affects the processes of knowledge creation and affects what I call the Turing galaxy. So AI is shaping the knowledge ecosystem we live in. And as I like to say, AI is the new printing press. Just as printing press once codified standards and reshaped the mechanisms of authorship, dissemination, assessment, AI now redefines how we create, how we structure, how we validate knowledge. So in my definition, ars artificialiter cognoscendi, the word ars matters the most. Ars in Latin means skill, mastery, competence, something nourished, cultivated. And from design of algorithms to curation of training data, from fine-tuning parameters to the craft of prompting, in both developing and deploying of AI, every step requires human expertise. And so the intelligence in AI does not reside in the machine. It lives in the ingenuity of those who built it and in the competence of those who use it. That's why I believe we should stop asking whether machines are intelligent or they can think in a human sense. Of course not. But why don't we ask how we can think better with machines? How can they help us think better? How can we use them to externalize some cognitive functions and to enhance others, to reach insights neither humans nor machines could achieve alone? And that's the real question. How we can use AI to elevate the human condition, to generate original insights, to advance knowledge. That's why I call AI an artifice of human intelligence, in the deepest sense. So it's a result of intelligence that's bound to the scientific and technical expertise of building it. So how AI is designed, whose knowledge it reflects, what purposes it serves, these are all human decisions with real consequences. And here's where the human intelligence makes a difference in the choices we make, in how we design it, how we train AI, how we deploy it, how we use it. In a nutshell, an intelligent use of artificial intelligence. What is knowledge? $1 million question. In my book, Generative Knowledge, I draw on the pragmatist tradition, Peirce, James, John Dewey, where knowledge is conceived as a process. It's something we do. It's an active engagement with the world, tested and validated by its capacity to help us navigate reality, solve problems, orient our action. So the value of knowledge lies in what it allows us to accomplish, to achieve, from a very pragmatic perspective. And in particular, I adopt a constructivist approach where knowledge is constructed through experience, through practice, through doing. Biologists, Maturana and Varela, captured this really beautifully. Every doing is knowing, and every knowing is doing. A large part of what we know is inseparable from what we create, right? Because knowledge is a constructive process, a making exercise. It emerges through acts of creations, acts of making. What we know is what we make. And that's why when AI can now retrieve, can summarize, can synthesize existing knowledge at an unprecedented speed, the fundamental skill becomes something else, becomes the ability to create knowledge that didn't exist before, to generate, to produce insights. And so to become knowledge makers instead of just being knowledge consumers or knowledge retrievers. Essentially, those who treat AI as a productivity tool, they gain efficiency, but nothing else. Those who treat AI as a cognitive partner in this process of knowledge creation, they gain something more valuable, the capacity to see what others miss, to connect what appears unrelated, to question what seems settled. For this reason, in my book, I'm calling for a fundamental shift from a consumption mindset to a creation mindset, a generative mindset. And I believe the future belongs to what I call the generative thinkers, individuals, practitioners who can expand, who can refine, who can create knowledge through inquiry, through exploration, through curiosity. And so, if knowledge is something we do, the future of knowledge belongs to those who can do, the generative thinkers, the knowledge makers that use AI to generate new knowledge. The word generativity may sound just like a buzzword, but I believe it captures something really essential. Generativity is the capacity to give rise to something new. The word itself carries this meaning in its very roots, from the Latin generare, which means to bring forth, to give life, to beget. Even in Sanskrit, to procreate, to forge bonds, to establish connections. So the idea of generating has always been tied to creating, nurturing, and connecting. And when I apply this concept to knowledge, I mean something very specific. Throughout human history, knowledge has shown this remarkable quality. What we know today is essentially the result of what previous generations knew, what they refined, challenged, and eventually passed it on. So each generation starts where the previous one left off. And this cumulative, recursive quality, so knowledge that breeds more knowledge, is what I call generativity. AI can generate content very easily, text, images, code, music. The machines produce, they output, but the content is not necessarily knowledge. Output is not understanding. And this is where the word generativity makes a difference. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to create something genuinely new? What does it mean to advance what we know? To push the boundaries of our understanding? And so I believe the big merit of this word, generativity, is that it helps us focus on what really matters. In all the noise about AI, the hype, the fear, the speculations, and so on, generativity brings us back to the core question. Are we creating something new? Are we advancing understanding? Are we giving birth to ideas that didn't exist before? If not, we are just shuffling content, rearranging what already exists. But when we truly generate, when we experience that knowledge that creates more knowledge, we participate in the most unique human act, the act of adding something to the world that wasn't there before. That's generativity. And this generativity, so the ability to generate something new, is ultimately one of the things that make us human. Generative knowledge is the central concept of my latest book, and the definition is plain and simple. Generative knowledge is that distinctive form of knowledge that creates new knowledge. It sounds almost circular, and that's intentional, but not all knowledge is generative. Some forms of knowledge are conservational, retentive, static. Knowledge that preserves, that stores, that transmits what already exists. And that's valuable. But generative knowledge does something more, something different. Generative knowledge has an intrinsic capacity to catalyze, to sustain, to propagate the creation of further knowledge. So when we combine what we already know with the right tools, the right people, and a genuine desire to explore, we can produce insights that didn't exist before. And this is generative knowledge, self-expanding, self-renewing, knowledge that begets knowledge, that gives birth to more knowledge, knowledge that is always expanding, always growing. So the fundamental question is whether we use AI to simply recycle what already exists or to generate something new. And this is generative knowledge. When I set out to understand how knowledge actually creates more knowledge, I looked for some recurring patterns, regularities observable across different eras, cultures, domains of inquiry. And so I have identified 6 principles that work together as an ecosystem, where none of them operates in isolation. And the strongest generative outcomes happen when all 6 principles converge. Knowledge comes alive when competence, tools, people, curiosity, learnability, and creativity work as a single force. The first principle of generative knowledge is what I call the iterative principle. Generative knowledge grows from existing knowledge. This may sound obvious, almost circular, but it carries profound insights and implications. Nothing emerges from vacuum. It means that new understanding always comes from reinterpreting or extending what was already there. Every new insight builds on what came before. And even the most surprising intuition relies on conceptual frameworks we have inherited and internalized from the past. That's why generative knowledge grows from existing knowledge. Or put it another way, one must already possess knowledge to produce more knowledge. Think about how science works, peer review, building on previous studies. So it's like a loop, a recursive loop where the output feeds the next input. And it's never really done, never finished, always evolving. So the first principle of generative knowledge tells us that knowledge is also generational, literally. Each generation begins where the previous one stopped. There's a continuity in this process. And so in a nutshell, it takes knowledge to generate new knowledge. The second principle is the instrumental principle. Generative knowledge is mediated by what I call epistemic technologies. We have never thought with our brains alone. From the earliest stone tools to language, from writing to printing press, from scientific instruments to AI, we have always extended our cognitive reach through external means. These tools do not just help us store or retrieve information. They reshape how we think, what questions we ask, what we can even perceive. So we think by tools. And the tools we create become the tools we think by. Every era is shaped by the tools through which thought and knowledge are produced. And AI is simply the latest, perhaps the most powerful, in this long trajectory of epistemic technologies, the tools we think by. And so, if knowledge is iterative and instrumental, probably is not a solitary process. And that brings it to the third principle of generative knowledge, what I call the social principle. Ideas are social. Knowledge itself is a social entity. So the principle states that generative knowledge thrives on collective intelligence. We think in dialogue with others, peers, communities, traditions, cultures. A unique feature of the human intellect is the ability to combine ideas from a variety of minds into a shared sense of insight. Knowledge creation flourishes when multiple minds interact, interplay, when they exchange ideas, when they share the same intellectual environment. And the great innovations in human history always emerged from networks of minds in a creative tension, so people sharpening each other's insights through exchange, debate, critique. And the more diverse the perspectives involved, the richer the outcome. And that's why generative knowledge thrives where different viewpoints meet, challenge each other, and produce something none could have reached alone. So, what fuels this whole engine, the iteration, the tools, the social aspect? There has to be a driver. And this is the fourth principle of generative knowledge, which I call the inquiry principle. Generative knowledge is driven by epistemic curiosity. After all, what pushes us to seek new knowledge? A genuine desire to know, the curiosity as an epistemic virtue. And curiosity generally operates in two complementary ways. Sometimes as the pleasure of exploring something new, and sometimes as the discomfort of sensing a gap in what we understand. So, epistemic curiosity means treating questions as more valuable than answers. This creates a virtuous cycle of exploration, discovery, inquiry. Knowledge that accumulates is just static and conservative, but knowledge animated by curiosity keeps moving, keeps asking, keeps pushing the boundaries further, keeps generating. The fifth principle of generative knowledge is the learnability principle. Generative knowledge requires a willingness to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I call this cycle of learning, unlearning, and relearning the cycle of learnability. That literally means the ability to learn. Learning how to learn, which is increasingly important in an AI-driven society. So just learning is not enough. Sometimes what we already know becomes an obstacle. All frameworks that block fresh insights. Unlearning means recognizing when established ideas no longer serve us, and probably, we need to make space for something new. And so relearning completes the cycle, integrating new understanding in a more flexible and fresh form. So the cycle of learnability demands the ability to reflect on how we learn, not just what we learn. Generating new knowledge requires this constant epistemic agility, this readiness to rethink and rebuild from within, the willingness to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And finally, the sixth principle, the creativity principle. Generative knowledge embraces intellectual creativity. Throughout this book, I advocate for what I call intellectual creativity. Creativity has been confined for too long into the domain of art, as if only painters or musicians or writers were creative. And I believe that's a misconception. Every form of knowledge creation is, in essence, a creative endeavor. That's why intellectual creativity is the driving force behind knowledge generation. Across every domain, every discipline, any field, intellectual creativity requires care, cultivation, practice, critical judgment. And in the deepest sense, intellectual creativity is the mother of generative knowledge. Speaking of creativity, in my book I use a term that may sound a bit unusual, and the term is intellectual creativity. I believe that creativity has been held hostage by a misconception for far too long. We have confined creativity to the field of arts, to the artistic domain, painting, music, literature, the so-called creative sector. But that's a profound misunderstanding. When a biologist formulates a hypothesis, when a mathematician finds an elegant proof, or a philosopher reframes an entire problem, something that didn't exist before comes into being. That's creation. That's why I use the term intellectual creativity, to reclaim creativity for the entire domain of knowledge. Wherever knowledge is being generated, creativity is at work. And intellectual creativity is also an epistemic virtue. Like all epistemic virtues, it requires cultivation. It's not a flash of inspiration that strikes the lucky few. It demands practice, exposure to diverse perspectives, the familiarity with the domain, and the judgment to distinguish what's genuinely valuable from what's just novel. And so intellectual creativity sits at the heart of my framework as the sixth principle of generative knowledge, is the driving force behind every act of knowledge creation in every field. Scientific revolutions, philosophical breakthroughs, or technological innovations. These are all acts of intellectual creativity. The motivation to create is what pushes knowledge beyond its own boundaries. That's why I believe creativity is not a gift for artists. It's the force behind every genuine act of knowing, and it belongs to anyone willing to cultivate it, willing to generate new knowledge. The conversation around AI has become a series of trenches. Every discussion splits into camps. Pick your side, defend your position, prove the other side wrong. And we have turned a complex and fascinating phenomenon into a battlefield, which makes it impossible to have a productive conversation on this topic. We have the perplexed versus the enchanted, existential threats on one side, revolutionary breakthroughs on the other. Some focus on dangers, bias, misinformation, surveillance, job displacement, and the so-called existential risks, while others focus on possibilities, discoveries, democratized access, enhanced creativity. So we have the risk camp versus the opportunity camp. And here is where it gets tricky. You talk about risks, you sound like you're limiting opportunities. And talk about opportunities, you sound like you're dismissing risks. So the narrative is so misleading. It forces us to choose one lane or one side, as if being critical and optimistic were mutually exclusive. That's why I believe this polarization makes us lose sight on what really matters. Polarized narratives produce polarized responses. Instead of picking your side to prove you're right or asking which side is correct, let's start asking, how can we work together on this? What are the consequences of using AI? Is there evidence of good consequences? Let's learn how to maximize these good consequences. Is there evidence of negative consequences? Let's face them, and most importantly, let's learn how to avoid them, how to fix them. If we can shift the question from who is right to what leads to better outcomes, I think that nature of the conversation will change. Even the narrative will change. And that shift may be the most important advancement of all, to rethink the narrative of AI in finding a common solution toward a shared perspective. There is a paradox at the core of our intellectual relationship with AI that I think it's underestimated. Essentially, AI makes content generation easier than ever, and yet the quality of that content depends more than ever on what you already know, on what you bring to the table. People with deep expertise in a field, they use AI and they can produce remarkable work. They know which question to ask. They know how to probe. They spot when something is off, when the output smells wrong. But people without that expertise, they just get results that look impressive, sound impressive, but are fundamentally shallow. And here's the problem. They cannot even tell the difference. So this is connected to the first principle of generative knowledge, as I frame it in my book, the iterative principle. It takes knowledge to create new knowledge. So without domain fluency, without that deep expertise, AI becomes something even dangerous. A sophisticated echo chamber. It reflects back statements that sound plausible or sound appealing, but they may be just deeply and profoundly wrong. Deep domain expertise is what unlocks AI's generative potential. Without a human expert asking the right questions or interpreting the outcome, or knowing the context and understanding the process, or just being able to validate the actual outputs, AI might produce apparently novel stuff, but probably meaningless or just plain wrong. And there is a term for this. It's the illusion of knowledge. And this is what happens when we confuse access to information with actual understanding. And AI essentially amplifies this illusion dramatically. The outputs sound academic, they sound professional, they use confident language, as I put it, it's the sex appeal of fluency. We feel we understand, but that feeling is just a trap. It's a cognitive comfort mistaken for comprehension. It's confidence mistaken by competence, and verbosity mistaken for understanding. So let's think AI as an amplifier, a powerful amplifier. If we have expertise, it amplifies our capacity to explore, to synthesize, to reach insights we couldn't reach alone. But if we lack expertise, it amplifies our blind spots, our gaps. It helps us move fast, but likely in the wrong direction. There is a catchphrase I use in my book, AI is raising the bar. And I mean it literally. So, for example, AI has made competent output available to everyone. AI excels at producing the average, the satisfactory, the good enough. And this is precisely the regime of mediocrity. So AI is unmasking what I call the it's okayness. And that changes everything. If everyone can produce competent work with minimal effort, that competent work has lost its market value. The middle ground, the it's okayness, is no longer valuable. AI handles mediocrity way better, faster, and cheaper than we do. So, if our work sits on that zone, the adequate, the satisfactory, the good enough, we are exposed, vulnerable, we are replaceable. The machine does what we do. And that's why mediocrity is no longer viable. It's no longer sustainable. So AI is killing mediocrity. And that means that the bar is rising for all of us. We can no longer afford on being average, on meeting the expectations, on being on the standard, even if the standard is very high. Expectations have shifted. The bar is higher. What counted as acceptable yesterday is insufficient today in any field, from education to professional settings. So, to be clear, AI is not eliminating human value. It's clarifying where human value actually is. And that's at the top, in depth of originality and the capacity to generate something new, to clear the bar higher and bring forward the expectations of what's possible. That we need deep domain expertise to recognize when outputs are superficial combinations instead of genuine insights, to add value that the machine cannot add. And what remains valuable is everything AI cannot do on its own. The genuinely original question, the unexpected connections, the deep judgment that comes from expertise. So the professionals who thrive will be those who operate above the line AI can reach, where intellectual creativity, domain mastery, and critical judgment make the real difference. We talk a lot about physical wellness, mental wellness, even digital wellness, but there is another dimension I'd like to address, and it's our relationship with knowledge itself. And I use a term, epistemic wellness, to describe this position to cultivate a healthy, balanced, a vital relationship with how we learn, how we think, how we create knowledge. And in a knowledge ecosystem that is increasingly shaped by AI, maintaining this balance has become a real challenge. Our cognitive resources are under pressure in ways we are only beginning to understand. Epistemic wellness means strengthening what I call a cognitive resilience, the capacity to maintain, to reorganize our critical, interpretative, argumentative resources when the informational environment around us is unstable, overloaded, and often even opaque. That means cultivating specific epistemic virtues: curiosity, judgment, openness to disagreement, attention to context. These are all habits of mind that can protect us from the subtle erosion that happens when convenience or fluency replaces depth, when speed replaces reflection, when those verbose or fluent AI outputs replace genuine understanding. And that's deeply connected to the illusion of knowledge I talk in my book. Epistemic wellness requires the awareness that feeling informed and being informed are very different things, and the discipline to care about the difference, especially when AI makes the gap so easy to ignore. And so, in an age where AI makes everything feel easy to know, epistemic wellness is a commitment to actually knowing with critical spirit, with a generative mindset, and most importantly, with care for our intellectual life. In my book, I propose a framework. I call it critical generative thinking. Critical thinking in the age of AI cannot be just defensive, spotting errors, debunking hallucinations, checking facts, and so on. That's necessary but insufficient. The generative dimension means using our critical faculties to build, to produce new understanding, new questions, new knowledge. And it's the pragmatist spirit here, thinking in order to create. And I ground this framework in four main pillars: epistemic competence, knowing where to search, which requires deep domain expertise; epistemic trust, knowing how to search, which means understanding how AI systems actually work; epistemic authority, so knowing how to validate, evaluating outputs through criteria of impact, novelty, transparency; and epistemic vigilance, knowing how to wait, maintaining active doubt, and resisting the comfort of easy answers. So the golden rule runs all throughout those four pillars. It takes knowledge to generate new knowledge. We cannot think critically about AI outputs in a domain we don't understand. Competence comes first, always. The more we know, the sharper our critical thinking can become. The less we know, the more vulnerable we are to accepting whatever the machines deliver. I end my book with a call to the generative thinkers. Generative thinkers are the people, practitioners, individuals who make generative knowledge happen. They are those who approach knowledge with a specific set of mental attitudes and dispositions. The conviction that what we know can always be expanded, refined, renewed through inquiry, curiosity. And so the generative thinkers are not defined just by their field or professions. They can be scientists, teachers, students, designers, entrepreneurs. Generative thinkers have always existed. I call them generative because they don't just hold knowledge, they activate, they advance, they catalyze new knowledge. They turn what they know into a springboard for discovery, exploration, generation. And after all, the generative thinkers are the people who use AI with intentionality and competence, not as an answer machine, not as an oracle, but as a partner in the ancient human project of creating knowledge. As I like to say, generative thinkers balance every act of delegation with a deeper investment in their own thinking. What really distinguishes the generative thinkers is a fundamental attitude. They don't just consume knowledge, they use knowledge as a raw material to create something that didn't exist before. And so the generative thinkers build on what came before. They master their tools. They think in dialogue with others. They stay curious. They are willing to learn, unlearn, and relearn, and they treat creativity as a discipline, not as a talent. And that's why generative thinkers are the reason AI will make us smarter, I believe, because they bring the competence, the curiosity, the creativity that turn a powerful machine into a meaningful intellectual partnership. In a world where AI can easily produce all kinds of content, the real edge will go to those who can use AI to generate new knowledge. Those who I call the generative thinkers. There is a story I tell in my book, a story everyone knows, but usually only half of it. In 2016, AlphaGo, an AI system developed by Google DeepMind, defeated Lee Sedol, the world champion of Go, the most complex Chinese board game ever invented. During the second match, AlphaGo played the famous move 37, a move so unexpected that centuries of Go tradition would have advised against that move. Commentators thought it was an error. It turned to be a brilliant move, never seen before. The world celebrated that move as a proof that AI could produce creative moves, surpassing human intuitions refined over thousands of years. But again, that's only half of the story. 2 days later, during the fourth game, Lee Sedol sat in silence for 30 minutes. Then he played the move 78, a move so perfectly conceived that commentators called it a divine move. That move by Lee Sedol reversed the entire match. And here is an astonishing detail. So AlphaGo had estimated that the probability of a human choosing that exact position at 1 in 10,000. That is the same probability he had assigned to its own famous move 37. So essentially, Lee Sedol reached the same frontier the machine had reached, and probably went even further. And I like to believe that Lee Sedol might never have played that move without AlphaGo pushing him beyond his own limits. And so the real story of AlphaGo is not about a competition between a machine and a human. It's about a collaboration, an alliance. It's not that a machine beat a human. It's that a machine helped a human play the most extraordinary move of his life. And this is what I call the Lee Sedol Effect. After all, the deepest value of AI lies in pushing the human performance, elevating the human potential, not replacing it. When human competence interacts with AI, when human creativity meets artificial intelligence, both reach outcomes neither could achieve alone. And that's the essence of generative